Doug, it's a delight to be here this morning to talk to you. As you know, I have long been interested in the sources of economic failure, in the mechanisms, particularly the social mechanisms that cause economic failures to persist, and in the mechanisms that lead to reform, even revolution. Over the years that I've been studying these questions, I've been profoundly influenced by your own works. I learned from your book, Structure and Change in Economic History, that you wrote published in the early 80s, that transaction costs are a very important determinant of economic success and economic failure. You explained in that book that many institutions arise to reduce transactions costs, that is, the costs of doing business. Many others have made this point as well, but in my mind, you stand out from the majority of the economists who make this position in that you recognize that institutions not only solve these transaction cost minimization problems well, but also in some cases do it very poorly. You recognize the existence of institutional successes as well as institutional failures. In the hands of many other economists, this insight has turned into a tautology, into a search for some explanation to explain every institution, every observed institution as efficient. The last time I made this point in class, and in fact it was a few weeks ago, I'm teaching my course on the political economy of institutions this semester, and I contrasted you with some other economists whose works we were discussing. A student put up her hand and she said, "Now I'm puzzled about something. How does Doug North distinguish between an efficient institution and an inefficient institution?" Of course, I gave her an answer, but I also wished at that time that you were there in the classroom so that I could have turned over the floor to you. So let me ask you this question. How do you distinguish between a good institution and a bad institution, economic failure and economic success?
Well, next time you have a student like that, call me and I'll show up in your class, Timur, and we can take it from there. Well, I ought to step back, really, because it took me a long time to get to this position. I started out as a good neoclassical economist, and indeed the whole development in economic history of what we call cliometrics was the application of neoclassical economic theory to history, and this got us a long ways. But it left a big puzzle, particularly when I moved from being an American economic historian to a European economic historian, and I tried to use the same kind of tools. They didn't make much sense, and they didn't make much sense because obviously when you look back enough in history, when you go to European economic history, you have long periods when economies and societies don't evolve, don't work, they stagnate, and you have other times when you get development. In fact, the great question we ask is, how did the rise of the Western world occur? And the rise of the Western world presumably implied that somewhere along the line you evolved a set of rules of the game, that's institutions, that led you to have development in the sense that we measure development. And that was a puzzle because neoclassical theory always assumed that you had an efficient world, efficient markets, and implicitly imperfect information. Well, as soon as you start to get around to look at institutions analytically, and I had to start doing that, it was quite clear that people operate on the basis of imperfect knowledge. They operate on the basis of beliefs that have evolved, and this doesn't necessarily produce institutions that are going to lead to you to be more productive and more creative, which is the heart of what we think of as economic development. And so then I had to start to figure out what there is about it. This is a long lead up, you understand, to your question, because really what you mean, I think, by efficient institutions is you have institutions that have low costs of transacting. You used the word yourself in the opening part. By transaction costs, we mean the costs of running an economic system. That's Ken Arrow's definition, and I like it. And presumably, the lower the costs for people to make exchanges and do things, then the less resources you have to use in that, and therefore the more likely you are to be able to realize potential. And indeed, there's a big trade-off between lower transaction costs and encouraging lower production costs, which are the other half of the cost picture. And so what we have, therefore, when we have efficient institutions, is there are institutions that enable us to make exchanges at a lower and lower cost of making the exchanges. Would that have satisfied your student?
I think so. I think she would have gone on to ask for some examples, and I gave her an example, which I think fits in with the answer that you've just given. This had to do with the medieval Mediterranean world, where you had a number of different legal systems that were available for merchants to use. At least in the part of the Mediterranean that was then controlled by Muslims, there were, of course, the Islamic courts, and there were Islamic forms of exchange, Islamic partnership rules that were used by long-distance traders. But there were also the Jewish equivalent of these partnership forms. There were the Christian equivalents. And the non-Muslim minorities, the Jews and Christians living under Islamic rule, were perfectly free to use their own courts and to use their own forms of exchange and forms of contracts if it so suited them. They were also free to use Islamic partnerships and to take their disputes to the Islamic courts. At that time, many non-Muslims were preferring to use the Islamic courts. They were preferring to do long-distance trade under Islamic partnerships, by forming Islamic partnerships as opposed to Jewish partnerships. Maimonides, the famous Jewish philosopher who lived in Islamic Spain, complains in one of his books that the Jewish merchants of Spain were doing business in the manner of Gentiles. What does he mean by this? The Gentiles to whom he was referring to were the Arab, the Muslim Arabs of Spain. And what did he mean by doing business in the manner of the Gentiles? It meant forming Islamic partnerships. Now, why were the Jewish merchants, when they could have formed Jewish partnerships and used the Jewish courts, why were they doing business in a different way? The reason is that the Islamic partnership law offered flexibilities that were very valuable to the merchants. Jewish partnership law required the financier, the person who was putting up the money, and the traveling merchant, the one who actually went from Spain, let's say, to Cairo and back doing business, required them to share the profits 50-50. Whereas Islamic law gave the merchant and the financier, the flexibility to set their own profit ratio. And depending on what they were going to trade in, depending on the reputation of the merchant, depending on the risks involved for the merchant, they could change the share. So evidently this was valuable enough that the Jewish merchants were preferring the Islamic to conduct their business by forming Islamic partnerships. Here is evidence that the players themselves, regardless of whether we as economists recognize what is efficient and what is not, the players themselves are telling us that one of these institutional forms was more efficient than the other.
That's a good starting point. I think of transaction costs as the cost of measuring and enforcing agreements. And that sounds innocuous, but of course it's not, because by measurement you mean that all of the attributes of an exchange can be measured. And if you can't measure them, then it's very hard to make exchanges because you don't know what the value of whatever it is you're exchanging is. So measurement and enforcement. And flexibility, of course, is one of the things that lowers measurement costs. If you have a flexibility to do things in different ways. I suppose I want to ask you back then, since you're an expert on the history of the Muslim world, I want to ask you...
Not quite an expert, I'm still learning.
Well, you're as much of an expert as we got in this room, friend.
Okay.
But I want to ask you, how then in a Muslim world would the fact that the state enforces or creates and enforces the institutions, would that make for inefficiency or efficiency in the world that you're talking about in the Muslim world? I.e., would the state be interested in efficiency, and in that sense try to adjust Muslim law so that you'd create institutions that would do this, or not?
Depends on the time period. In the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, when Islamic law, classical Islamic law, what is called the Sharia, evolved, the jurists who interpreted the Quran and the classical sources of Islam and formed classical Islamic law were very sensitive to the needs of merchants. And there's a very good reason for this, because many of them were merchants themselves, or many of them were investors. So the partnership law was developed by the Islamic jurists in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, was the most advanced partnership law for the time because it was created by merchants. And all these flexibilities were introduced because they had obvious efficiency implications. However, the Islamic law ceased to be controlled by people with an interest in commerce. Eventually, they became part of the bureaucracy, and they started living off of tax revenues, living off of arbitrary confiscations, and they lost that interest, and that is one of the factors that contributed to the stagnation of Islamic law at a time when European business law, European commercial law, European financial institutions were evolving, becoming more efficient. Nothing was changing in the Middle East.
Well, that's very interesting, and it makes for the contrast, and something I'd like to explore further with you, because one of the things when I write about the rise of the Western world, usually I start in about the 10th century, and I look at the way in which beliefs were evolving in the Judeo-Christian world of Europe at that time, and how those beliefs gradually evolved into beliefs that were more congenial to institutions that would encourage productivity and creativity and so on. It was a very gradual affair. You evolved beliefs, but it was a long process, for example, to go back to something that we both have been talking about, which is usury laws and things like that. It was a long process of change to move. First of all, you evaded usury laws by getting around them with various kinds of subterfuge, and then gradually, however, the beliefs enabled you to directly get institutions that, again, to go back to my transaction cost, devised institutions that lowered the costs of making exchanges in different kinds of settings. And that was that's the story of the rise of the Western world, really. I mean, we have a lot of stories about technology and so on, but technology, in my view, is a derivative. If you get, instead of institutions that encourage people to be productive and creative, then down the road you'll encourage technological change, you'll encourage all the kinds of things that we see arising in the Western world from 10th century on up to the 18th century, by which time really Western Europe has come to dominate the rest of the world. Now, as you pointed out, the Muslim world up through the 12th century really was the creative part of the world, whereas the Western world was a backward part of the world. Now, somewhere around that it changes. Do you have a short answer or even a long answer to what made the Muslim world stagnate or relatively stagnate as compared to the Western world?
There's several factors, I think, that played an important role. Since you brought in the matter of with the evolution of beliefs in Western Europe, which I agree with you, this was a very important process, critical process. Let me start with the beliefs. Usury laws existed in Islam, they existed in Judaism, they existed in Christian Europe. In each of these contexts, people evaded them. There are many other rules that were associated, at least in the Middle Eastern context, associated with that were associated with the religion. One difference between the Middle East, or the Islamic Middle East, and Europe is that many more rules that have something to do with economics, something important to do with economics, were anchored in the Quran or anchored in very early Islamic traditions. Now, why does that make a difference? Because if something is clearly stated in a holy book, a book that is treated as God's word, it is much harder to challenge that, because to challenge it, to say we ought to change it, immediately subjects one to the charge of heresy, and it can end one's career, and much, much, much worse. And of course, there are examples of this. In the economic sphere, I'll just give one example. Islamic inheritance laws are stated in the Quran. Stated very specifically that an individual's testamentary rights are reserved to 1/3 of his or her estate. 2/3 of the person's estate are to be divided according to a complex set of formula among all members of the extended family, not just the nuclear family, but the cousins and uncles and grandparents and grandchildren and so on. Now, it's often been remarked that this prevented this served an equalizing role. I think that a more important role that it played was in preventing the accumulation of capital. We never saw the rise of an aristocracy in the Middle East, and as we did in Europe. It was, whereas in Europe, because the inheritance laws, even though the church had a lot to say about the inheritance laws, because the inheritance laws were not anchored in the Bible, it was much easier to reinterpret those inheritance laws in many different ways. So you got primogeniture in certain places, you got a bewildering array of inheritance laws, and there was a great deal of experimentation. This never happened in the Islamic world. So I've given a couple of giving you a couple of factors.
Yeah. Let's move up to date then, since
Yes.
we've been sneaking up on coming up to
Yes.
date. Because when we get up to the modern world, it's true that the story you and I tell when we teach economic history about the Western world is that you evolved a set of institutions that encourage technological change, that encourage the development of human capital, all the things that now we know are the keys to really high-income parts of the world. And it has been, and still is in the Western world, a give and take between beliefs and institutions, and we don't always get it right. I mean, I want to, in fact, one of the things that clearly is a major part of telling the story in modern times is the fact that the institutional structure in lots of parts of the world, not just the Islamic world, but in lots of parts, like in sub-Saharan Africa, you have sets of institutions that don't produce any development at all. And I guess that raises the question that you've given a historical reason why the Muslim world stagnates after 1200. How do we get out of a problem like that? How do we create institutions, therefore, that are going to shift you from stagnation to development? You want to tell me that about the Muslim or any part of the world you'd like to talk about?
Well, I'll stick with the Middle East, since we now have stated some of the background. This process actually has begun. It's a very difficult process. In the 19th century, the Muslim merchants in the Middle East starting in Istanbul and Cairo and Alexandria, managed to lobby successfully for the establishment of secular commercial courts. One rarely reads about this in histories of the Middle East, of the modern Middle East. Yet I think this was an enormously important step. Establishing a secular commercial court in Istanbul meant that the jurisdiction of the Islamic courts was being narrowed, that commerce and eventually finance was taken out of the jurisdiction of the Islamic courts. It's very significant that the drive to do this came from Muslim merchants, because they were the ones who had to, for whom the alternative was using a legal system that was simply not suited to the modern age. Now, they tried to do this, and this led to further steps, further efforts at westernization. Western-style courts have been established all across the Middle East, and the Middle East is certainly more advanced and economically more efficient than it was in the 19th century. But this is a long process. One can import technologies, as you've noted in your works on numerous occasions, numerous contexts. One can transfer technology from one society, from a very developed society to the least developed society. You can build a fabulous factory in the middle of the Sahara Desert, in the least developed part of Africa, but carrying the culture that goes with it, the norms, the trust, the shared understandings. This is very difficult, and this is a very slow process that I think is going to take some more generations.
Good. Well, that gets us really, we really haven't defined what we mean by institutions, and you've just done it, you snuck it in on me, because obviously institutions are not only formal rules of the game, which we've talked about, like court systems and constitutional law and statute law and common law and regulations. There are also informal norms of behavior which in my view, are as important as the formal rules of the game. That is, if you have formal rules of the game, they can specify all kinds of things, but if they're not backed up by informal norms that complement those in ways, then the rules don't work at all, and usually you can't get enforcement of the rules because, in fact, they run counter to them. And so that if we have then a proper institutional framework that's going to create an environment that's going to create economic growth and productivity and so on, it's got to be both. Now, you can get a formal law just by having some political entity that can do that, create a rule, but we know that's not sufficient. For example, some of the work I'm in the midst of doing now is I'm doing a study comparing Latin American and North American economic growth over the last 4 centuries. And one of the things that happened in the early 19th century is that Latin American countries, when they became independent, they adopted something like the U.S. Constitution in the view that this would produce an environment like the United States and conducive to growth. Well, you know that the result was radically different. And the reason why it was is you had the same rules on the books, but the enforcement and the complementary norms were very different, and the result is that the formal laws didn't work at all like that. So one of the things, therefore, we're really very interested in is the informal norms, how they evolve, and how you create a set of informal norms, if you can create them, that will get you to complement really formal rules that work well. Yes. You want to try that one on?
Well, I do, and I also want to make sure we get to the issue of ideology, the related issue of ideology, on which you've had some very important things to say. I don't think anybody has an easy answer to the question of how we transfer informal norms from one country to another. One thing that helps is intellectual openness and openness to mobility across societies. In Europe, right now. There's a great deal of mobility across societies. They're completely free to read each other's literature, to travel to each other's countries, and this leads to a rapid diffusion, and it also has the positive consequence of weeding out inefficient norms, or norms that hinder creativity and that lower productivity. In the Middle East, certainly and to a much greater degree in parts of Africa, this mobility is reduced, first of all, by poverty. People who are living at subsistence don't have the luxury to travel around the world to see how other people are living, how other people are doing business, but also by efforts on the part of repressive regimes to keep information about other societies out. At least information that would upset existing arrangements. I believe that this is going to be less of a problem in the 21st century because of the internet revolution. Some of the countries of the Middle East and North Africa, Tunisia is one example, Saudi Arabia is another example. They have tried, and they're still trying, at least in Saudi Arabia's case, to monitor the internet. Saudi Arabia, it is said, has 10,000 people working on blocking new websites as they come up. And apparently it's a losing battle. There are ways that their citizens can pick up whatever information they want through servers in other countries. I think pretty soon they will realize that they have lost the battle, and whether it's China or Saudi Arabia or any other repressive regime, information will start filtering in. Let me ask a question that we've sort of, or raise an issue that we have touched on but not addressed directly. One of the major contributions you've made to economics, and indeed to the social sciences in the last 20 years, is to bring up and show the importance of ideology in as a factor in the economic success or economic failure of civilizations. Many economists, many members of our profession, and many other social scientists as well, are inclined to treat ideology as part of the superstructure. And what they mean by this is that it is just a reflection, ideology is just a reflection of the structures of society, the power relations, the distribution of income. That is what we ought to be studying, and not ideology, which is just an effect of that. I wonder if you'd comment on that and give us an example of where ideology does matter.
Well, that takes me in a long foray here, Kuran, Timur. When I first started to get involved in looking at institutions, I had to ask where they come from. And if you ask where they come from, you eventually trace back to they come from the beliefs people have. And so that gets you to say, well, where do beliefs come from? And that gets us, I hate to get into it, but into cognitive science, because beliefs come from the way in which the mind interprets what's going on in whatever we would think of as the real world. Now, if you take a physicist and say, well, where did your theory come from? The physicist can get down to fundamentals like quarks or some basic entity that exists in the physical world, and build your theory up from the bottom up. You can do the same in chemistry, and you can do the same in biology and in genetics. Now, we don't have any innate fundamental in the social sciences. There isn't any reality out there when I ask you what is the structure of a society. What there is there's a construct that we evolve in our mind that is the way in which we interpret what's going on. And even the best theory in the social sciences is a story. It's a construct that hopefully, if we've done it right, mirrors enough of what's going on in the quote, the real world, so that if we get it right, then when we act on the basis of the theory, we get results that are consistent with what we intended them to be. So there's an identity then between beliefs and actions and outcomes. And that, of course, that's true in the physical sciences. In the physical sciences, you go into the lab and you, on the basis of a theory, you put together experiments, and then presumably the outcome is something you can measure. Well, our problem in the social sciences is that it's a construct always, and the only identification is between, as I said, the beliefs producing outcomes that are intended. Now, human beings, ever since the beginning of time, have tried to understand the world around them, and therefore, whether they used witchcraft or dogmas or astrology throughout history, they've always constructed views about the world. And that's fine, and we all do it, and we've been doing it ever since the beginning of time. The question is, how good are those beliefs, or in this case, ideologies or organized belief systems? How good are they in terms of being tools by which to understand and create institutions? Because beliefs produce institutions, which in turn then produce certain kinds of outcomes.
And sometimes those beliefs are terribly flawed. One example from the past century is the beliefs that undergirded the socialist system, and specifically the communist system that was based on central planning.
Yeah, good. Well, let me pick up, because it so happens I'm writing a chapter in the book I'm writing on the process of change, which is the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. And it goes in the following sequence. You have Marx and Engels that create a belief system, Marxism, and the belief system in turn energized Lenin when he came to power to implement that, and he implemented it by using that set of beliefs to create a set of institutions once he got into power in communist Russia in the 1920s, to create a whole new society. The institutions, some of them worked very well, like those creating heavy industry and so on. Some of them didn't work very well, like agriculture. But nevertheless, overall, in the period that we're talking about, by the time we get to the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet Union has become a superpower, like the United States. So here you had a belief system that created institutions that produced a set of results that transformed the world in the 20th century. Now, that's fine, but beginning in the probably mid-1970s, productivity and growth slows down in the Soviet Union. And as it slows down, then presumably what you're doing isn't working. And so if you have an ideal world where you have perfect relationship between beliefs and then feedback if they don't work, then if they don't work, you adjust the beliefs, and if the world stayed constant, you'd eventually get it right, in the sense you'd evolve a set of beliefs that worked because the world was staying constant. But of course the world doesn't stay constant, it keeps evolving too. But what happened in the Soviet Union by the mid-70s is that the kind of beliefs that evolved, you didn't get much feedback. Why is something we want to explore, which is why ideologies tend to be inflexible at some point in time, and you implied that by your story about the Muslim world. Yes. From the 12th century on, because eventually in the communist world, it led to a grinding to a halt of all productivity growth and to stagnation and the end of the Soviet Union. The most extraordinary story in history, because it's probably the only time in history we ever had an empire which fell without external forces doing anything to directly create its collapse.
Let me add one thing to this feedback process that you mentioned. Of course, it was very distorted. It was an imperfect process. One thing that contributed to the distortion was that people were afraid to speak their minds. Many people could see that something was wrong with somewhere. Everybody had to stand in queues for everything from meat to shoes, and the quality of what they got when they ultimately reached the front of the queue was very poor. But they were not free to. They were free to grumble about this. They were not free to speculate about what in the system, in the Soviet system, what in the communist system might be the cause. They could find fault with factory managers, with incompetent clerks who hadn't processed the orders right, incompetent truck drivers who hadn't brought the merchandise in on time, but they were not free to ask fundamental questions of the sort that we have been asking today. Are our institutions keeping transactions costs to a minimum? Are they solving coordination problems? Are they creating incentives for rent seeking, for corruption, which needn't be the case if we change the institutions? And the more people decided to keep quiet or decided to pay lip service to to communist principles, the harder it became for others to do this.
Yeah, well, you've done a lot of interesting work, and in fact, what you've done along these lines, I think, has opened all of our eyes to the difference between repressed views that lie underneath the surface and then only emerge in particular concepts and therefore produce very rapid change at certain moments in history. Is that true anymore, though? If particularly your illustration about the internet and the failure to be able to use to prevent information, are we going to get more rapid change and more optimistic shift of institutions to become more efficient because information costs have fallen so much?
Possibly. News can travel very fast all across the world through the internet. And it is possible that if some of the Middle Eastern autocracies start falling through the benefit of the internet, the news could spread and we could see a process similar to that in Eastern Europe, except much faster. But there is a problem, and that is even though the internet is now available pretty much everywhere in the world, the amount of information on the internet is growing exponentially. And just as the existence of information in a good university library doesn't imply that it will ever be used, the existence of an internet site that points to ways that one can manage a society better, that points to better institutions, doesn't mean that that is necessarily going to be discovered, or that people will necessarily want to discover that, because what people want, what information people want to have access to, is a function of the beliefs that they have at any given time.
Well, let me wind it up then, Timur, by asking you the $64,000 question, which is, we know the kind of institutions that produce productivity, growth, so at least in today's world. It may not be tomorrow's world, but today's world. What I don't think we know is how to get there. Yeah. How we get, let's say, in sub-Saharan Africa, how we get societies that are completely falling apart and productivity is still going down. How do we get them to develop? And now, if the lowering cost of information is not a sufficient reason, what can we do, or what brief advice do we have to give to failing economies or economies that aren't working well to get them to do better?
As you said, it's a $64,000 question. I might have said a $64 million question. It's a difficult one. I think an absolutely important measure, critical measure, would be to open up these societies. You have societies that are in sub-Saharan Africa that are terribly inefficient, that are highly protected against their neighbors. There's practically no trade between African countries, and I think they have a great deal to gain from opening themselves up to trade. They're afraid of being colonized. They're afraid of people from the outside world out-competing domestics, but I don't see how they could do any worse than they're doing right now.
You've taken me back to where I think, in my view, we should end, which is beliefs again. Yeah. And if it's beliefs, then what we really need to know, I'm putting my favorite hobby horse into it, is how human beings learn and why they learn what they do, how flexible they are in when they've had some set of beliefs, changing that set of beliefs, and adjusting to them. And I don't think we know a lot about that. That's the frontier of cognitive science. It's where I'm working these days. But I have to say that as of now, we are just beginning. I think we're going to get somewhere along the lines you've suggested, ways by which we're going to force people to change their views and be able to adapt to things that have been outside of their purview. I hope that's where we're going, because if it is, why, there's hope for human beings.
Well, you're leading the way, and I'm looking forward to your book. And maybe the answer to the $64,000 question will be there.
Thank you.
I've enjoyed this.